Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean, and today we are talking about Azul Duel, which really pleasingly rhymes, and was provided to us for review, but the thoughts in this video are all our own.
Azul Duel is the latest in the Azul series and is still designed by Michael Kiesling, but it specifically plays for only 2 players. Let's look at how it plays.
You start the game with a player board, 1 dome plate, a couple of tokens, and a bunch of tiles just waiting to get drafted. On your turn, you can draft one of 3 things. Dome plates, which you add to any empty section on your player board. Tiles, take all of a matching color from any one factory, and then stack the rest in a pile on the moon section, or take all of a matching color from all moon sections. And finally, bonus tiles, which are only available once a factory has been cleared. Once everything has been drafted, players add up points for the round by placing a tile from each full row on a dome plate and scoring for connected tiles in horizontal and vertical rows. Also, you can pair your bonus tiles to fill empty spots in a row and score those rows in the same way. Then take negative points for the first player tile or tiles you couldn't place. Then you refill everything and do it all again. After 5 rounds of drafting and placing, you do one final scoring, including adding up points for the 3 active bonus tiles, and then the greatest tile layer is named.
This is a step up in complexity from regular Azul. There are a lot more things to consider, and on your turn, you do have the option of choosing more than just your regular tiles, and that leads to that more complex decision making. That said, it's not a super heavy game.
Yeah, it's not, and we should really talk about right out of the gate is a lot of folks are going to say, well, doesn't regular Azul play for 2 players? Why is there a 2-player version? You know what? You're 100% regular Azul. Totally, it's a great 2-player game. Summer Pavilion, great 2-player game. All of them work just fine for 2 players. But I think the trick here is don't think about this just as this is the Azul. This is the only Azul to play with 2 players. More that this one really only works for 2 players, and it's just because that's how the system is. It's an opportunity to put this system into this game, but it happens to work for 2 players. But that said, yeah, I totally agree. This is that little bit of complexity step up because of all those different drafting decisions that you've got now, because you got those 3 different bits that you got to think about, and it's the timing of those as well.
Yeah, and the timing can make a really big difference because in the regular version of Azul, you always have to take tiles on your turn, and that can really put you in a bad spot. Whereas now, if you're in that position, you might still have the option of taking one of the plates. What are they called again?
The dome plates.
The dome plates, and using that. Or you may even have a bonus chip you can take. So that might get you out of a bit of a pinch if you still have those options available.
Yeah, so we found it's a little push-pull in terms of the hate drafting. So it is sometimes a little harder to really like screw somebody over and have one of those turns where they've got to take those 5 tiles they didn't want. You can still do that sometimes. But there are like kind of other ways to sneakily screw people over too, because if you're watching what they're collecting and you're watching those plates, you need the right plate to put those tiles on. So if you want to put 3 reds, you need there to be a place for 3 reds to go. So if I'm watching Jess and I see that there's only 1 with red as an option, I can take that, and now those reds are just locked. They're just stuck there until the next round when she can maybe take one of those dome plates. And so that is now like sometimes even a more hateful hate drafting.
Yeah, although those dome plates, there are some of them that have a multicolor space, which does get you out of a tricky situation. And there's also that one, which is interesting, that gets filled in automatically if the other 3 are filled in. And I think that's interesting too, because in Azul, you do want to try and fill your rows and columns so that they're like touching each other, because that's going to get you the most points. And that encourages you to do that because you want to fill 3 of those 4 and get that 4th one put in for you.
Yeah, and this one, it feels a lot harder. Like it really does. You feel like you're not doing as much. Partly that is also because there's a 6th row that you've got to fill in, and that one can be tough to do, and it's hard to
flip that switch in your brain, because I'm used to doing, 1 to 5. The 5s are hard, but they're not impossible. And usually I've got 3 or 4 or even 5 of those sometimes filled in a game. Here, it is really hard to get even like 3 of those 6 rows filled in, but it does give you another option so you're not as stuck with things. And it feels good when you actually fill them in.
Yeah, but you aren't going to get as much of a sense of completion as you do in the original one. Because the original one, you can really feel like, depending on what other players are doing, that you managed to fill a good chunk. You certainly aren't doing that here, so you're doing it more strategically.
Yeah, it's rare that I felt like I nailed it. And full disclosure, I've not felt like I've nailed it, because we've played this 5 times and I have won 0 of those times. Not only have I won 0, I haven't got within 10 points of Jess yet. And one time, I even snuck in like a sneaky goal that gave negative points. Didn't tell her, knowing she wouldn't look. She noticed halfway through the game, still finished most of those, and still managed to beat me. So yeah, this has been an uphill battle for me, but I still do like it, and I enjoy the challenge. But it does feel more challenging, and it's going to feel twice as challenging if the only person that you play against is Jess.
I do think it feels slightly less negative. Maybe that's because I've won. But for me, because I'm finding, because of that 6th row and because of the different decisions you can make when drafting, I'm not ending up with a giant stack of tiles, because that can be a huge amount of negative points. And that hasn't really happened in our games, which I like.
Yeah, and also those bonus tiles, because those you squish 2 of those together if they match, or 3 of them if they don't match, to fill in an extra spot. And that often means you can do 1 more line than you thought that you could, because you just didn't get that tile. But the drafting also is a little bit more interesting in this, because when you take a tile off one of those factories, or 2 or whatever you take, you pile the rest of them up. And that can be really strategic, thinking about what is the other person going to take.
Yeah, and that is a huge addition, because you're not just pushing them all into the center. This just stacking can be a big choice, because it might be setting yourself up for success. If you know that you want to get like 3 of one tile and there's only 1 on each of them, you're like, well, if I can stack it just right, I might be able to get all of them. But then I also run the risk of presenting that option to the other player too.
Yeah, so you really want to be thinking about what do they want, what do you want, which has been true in all of the Azuls.
So in terms of replayability, there are a few things that come into play. One of the biggest are the varying goal cards, because in regular Azul, you are just scoring for like rows, columns, and the same of one type of tile that is in all of the rows. This time, there are 8 options. There are 4 tiles and they're double-sided. So you might still have scoring for columns, but you might not even have any of the regular scoring tiles.
Yeah, that is interesting. And a few of those, so there are 8, and 3 of them are kind of what you'd expect. They're horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. I got diagonal right, 1 out of 3. And then there's also ones around the outside. There's also ones in the corners. I'm just going to show you all of them. And then there's one that is 5 different colors in a line, which is quite tricky. And then the most interesting one, I think, is if you've got that kind of dome plate that's got the little bonus one that you plomp on. If you haven't got those bonus ones on, it's -3 for every bonus one you haven't got on. That's the one I snuck in when I tried to trick Jess and beat her still with like sneaky play. It still didn't work, but I think that one is really interesting, because it really makes the dome plate drafting a lot more interesting.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is 2 points for the multicolored space, but you only score it if all of your multicolored spaces are covered. So that's interesting too, because that can be a lot of points. But if those spaces are separated, then you're getting less points from like connected tiles.
Yeah, and in case of both of those as well, we found, and those are flip sides of one of the tiles, we found when that tile is out, that dome plate drafting becomes something that really moves up front and center, where especially with the ones with the bonus one, you kind of don't want to take those. So you end up running to that space first to get those rainbow tiles, even spending a point to take one off the top to take a rainbow tile, and just avoid those and force the other person to get those.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest like variability and replayability is going to be how that changes. But because it's a drafting game, that is also a huge factor. The tiles are going to come out in different orders. Who's taking what is going to be different orders. How you're laying out those dome plates is going to be different along with the scoring tiles. So like you said, we've played it 5 times already, and every time has felt different.
Yeah, and if you've played Azul, you know what you're getting into with that stuff. It's all of that stuff that you would expect. It is that drafting, that playing against your opponent with the drafting, thinking what do they want, what do I want, and it's that cost-benefit analysis that you're constantly making. Yeah, it really is in that kind of abstract strategy, puzzle-making game.
Let's move on to components. So this is a bit of a mixed bag. First of all, the main thing, the tiles are lovely. They're round, they're chunky, they feel really great, and they come in a nice bag. And so that part is what you would hope for from the Azul games.
Yeah, I think, yes, in terms of mixed bag, the bag itself is terrific. The tiles are absolutely terrific. So I guess the mixed part of it, a little bit, are, first of all, the one that annoyed us, I think both the most, is the little tower. So you got the little tower that you would see in, I think all the Azul games after the first one have had it, that you drop your used tiles into. And it's kind of just an extra, but the tricky is because of the small box, you've got to take that apart every time and put it back together. I would take the small box over being able to put that back together. So given the choice, I'm definitely I think that they made the right choice, but that is going to bother a couple people, I'm sure. The other thing is that the player boards are a little bit thinner, and that's because they can fold over to fit in that small box. Again, I'm happy with the small box. I would take the small box over a thicker board, and I'm fine with that choice, but again, that might bother some people.
And you are putting the dome plates out on your player board. So it's not just like this whole thin layer that you're sliding the tiles on. The tiles are going on the thicker plate. So I think that maybe played into the decision a bit as well. But it is just worth noting that it is a little bit thinner for the player boards and for the boards where you're keeping track of your scores. But the dome plates are nice and thick, and everything you're handling and playing with is really good quality.
And that brings us to final thoughts. And I think for me, the way that I think about this is really comparing it to the other Azul games. Like in a void, if this is the only Azul game that exists, it's great. I would be like, terrific. I really like this. What a cool pattern making game. But that's generally not how people are going to think about this. They're going to think, how does this fit within the pantheon of Azul games? And I would probably put it second or third, I think, overall. So I think this is doing kind of what they tried to do with Queen's Garden, where they tried to ramp up the complexity a little bit, but they went maybe a smidge too far, and there was just some weird choices in the color palette and in a few other things with that, where it didn't really fit for us, and I know it didn't for a bunch of folks. This one, I think, does what that was trying to do, just a lot smoother. And I think it works really nicely that it's the 2-player game, because you've got that complexity, but you're not adding, it's not going to drag so much. So I think that's one way that they kind of helped themselves a bit. And they were just able to do some things that were only going to work at the 2-player game that really make the drafting decisions interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing, is the drafting has made a lot more interesting, because it's not just the one decision of what kind of tile you're going to take. So I agree. I would probably have this about second, where I think the first might still be at the top for me, just because of the ability to introduce it to players and play with lots of players. But we have played Azul a ton, and we tend to play most of our games 2 players. So I like having this option that does increase the complexity, but not too much to a too high of an extent, and is a player count that we just tend to play with. And this comes in such a nice small little box, and that is a bonus. This is quite a bit smaller than the other Azuls.
Yeah, for living in a London flat and having not a lot of space, I really appreciate that about it. And that is it. That is Azul Duel. What is your favorite of the Azul games? Please let us know in the comments below. I'd love to see people's rankings of the 5 different Azul games. I think there's 5 that exist so far.
Thank you so much for watching. As usual, please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.